Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's CITP lecture. We're very lucky today to have Professor Sam Wang from Princeton University. Sam is a professor of molecular biology and neuroscience here at the university. So as if that isn't broad enough in terms of interests in research, he's going to talk today about yet a third topic on which he's been doing very interesting research, namely gerrymandering. Sam has a bachelor's degree from Caltech in physics, a credential I like especially myself. He is a PhD from Stanford, and he has worked also for the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources before coming here to Princeton and joining the faculty. So Sam's work has been very influential in this field, and so I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Please welcome Sam Wang.
All right. Thank you, Ed, for that very kind introduction. Ed and I graduated just 1 year apart at Caltech. He was class of '85. I was class of '86. Always looked up to Ed, 1 year ahead. And here I am looking up to him again. Okay, it's such a pleasure to be colleagues at Princeton, as we've been for some time. Thanks for coming out. I'm so pleased to see everyone come out at a time where I think the topic I'm talking about is of great intellectual interest to me, and I think of some pretty significant importance to our democracy at a pretty key moment in our nation's history. And so what I'd like to do is talk today about gerrymandering, define it, talk about how long it's been around, how much worse it's gotten in the last few decades, and I would characterize it as one of several strange features left over from the founding of our republic that, since we're in the Center for Information Technology Policy, I'll call it part of a legacy system that is left to us by the founders, and which is a bug in democracy. And it's one of several bugs in democracy. There are others that I could talk about. Today's topic, the bug in question, is gerrymandering. So what I'd like to talk about is how to define it, perhaps how to fight it, and I'm going to talk about several possible bug fixes and the fundamental problem that that faces anyone who would like to fix this particular bug. For those of you who are from the tech world, there are difficulties in fixing this kind of bug in government that are not the same problems as in the tech sphere. And I want to mention that a little bit. Namely, the issue is the interaction of math, technology, and law. And that intersection of those three domains starts to really put limits on exactly what the right strategies are for addressing this kind of problem. And so I want to perhaps fuse those things together and show you a little bit of the road ahead. So that's where we're going to head today. Pardon me, I'm actually a little bit under the weather, so I hope that my voice will carry okay. So I want to introduce the idea of this bug in democracy in terms of this time that we live in. And this is a slide I use for multiple purposes, but it's just to remind you that, that majority rule does not come easily in our electoral system. And right now, there's a lot to say about that. But this is just a graph, and this is not about gerrymandering, which concerns districting. This is about the presidency, but it's just to show you the kinds of things that are happening. And really, this is a graph showing the popular vote margin of the person who became president. So if the person who became president won the popular vote, then that person's above the zero axis here on the vertical part. If the person lost the popular vote and yet became president, then that person is indicated by a red dot here. And I want to take you back, not take you back from modern times and take you back to the period between the Civil War and what's called the Progressive Era. And this is a period that is called, the first part of it is called Reconstruction, the second part is called the Gilded Age. Really, they're part of one big era in American politics where we as a nation were trying to recover from and adapt to the aftermath of the Civil War. And in some ways, the Civil War was quite unifying. Before the Civil War, the United States was a plural noun. Afterwards, the United States became a singular noun. The United States is the country that I'm a citizen of, and that's not the way that people used to say it before the Civil War. So there were some pretty major changes in the Civil War: the freeing of slaves, the attempted secession, and then that attempted secession then ended. But here's what I want to show you. That was a time of racial divisions, technological disruption. If you think about these things, obvious racial divisions having to do with the enslavement of millions of people, technological disruption. This is a time when railroads were coming into wide use. It was a time when the typewriter was invented. So the reason the Gettysburg Address is handwritten is because Lincoln did not have a typewriter available to him at the time that he wrote it. It was a time of increasing inequality, and it was a time of deep, deep partisanship where the parties were at each other's throats. And I'm really hoping that this seems a little bit familiar to you. I will also point out that it was a time when the popular vote winner, Rutherford Hayes, lost the popular vote, as did Benjamin Harrison, but yet those two people became president. And so it was a time of close elections, which is, I think, something that's closely related to the deep partisanship of the time. Now, I've set this up for you, and I want to show you that we are also at a time of similar, what I would call crisis. So at some level, the good news is that we've been here before. The bad news is that that was a pretty rough time in US politics. And now we live in a time of racial divisions, going back perhaps to the civil rights era, technological disruption for obvious reasons that we think we are all aware of, increasing economic inequality, and again, deep partisanship. And this just to show you that there's a constellation of events that's at play in our, what I would call the second Gilded Age, that raises challenges to the stability of our democracy. And if those of you who, there are those of you who are older who maybe remember a time when the parties talked to each other more often, a time when laws were made in perhaps in some kind of bipartisan fashion and so on. That was a time that corresponds to this long period, this long, nearly century from 1900 to about 1992. This long period when elections were won by larger margins. You can see landslides from people like Roosevelt, Nixon, Eisenhower, pretty large winning margins. And so there's this national consensus that seems to have broken down somewhat, and this good faith between the two parties that has really been notably absent in the last several years. And so this time of deep partisanship is something that actually is part of the fuel that drives what I'm going to talk about today, gerrymandering. And I just wanted to show you, to give you a backdrop, that we live in a particular time that's unusual, and that those of you who are younger, I was talking to a student of mine who said that he was born in 1998, which really gave me a turn when I thought about that. I was born in 1967. But he does not remember a time before the current era of partisanship. And so I had to tell him, look, you got to go read Before the Storm by Rick Perlstein. That'll tell you something about what's happening. And so we started talking about exactly what politics used to be like. And so, maybe this is the more usual time. It's hard to know what's unusual, but anyway, it's a time that echoes the first Gilded Age. And I just want to use that to introduce the kind of trouble that we seem to be in as a nation. I will say the one good thing about the Gilded Age was people back then remembered the Civil War and remembered what national division could do to the country, and they didn't want to do that again. We lack this memory. I know this is very cheery. Okay, so here's a Republican president from the end of the Gilded Age. He was the second president. He was president shortly into the Progressive Era, and in some ways he encapsulates the Progressive Era, Teddy Roosevelt. And after he left office and was safely insulated from politics, he started talking about the necessity for popular rule. I'm just going to read you from his speeches and his writings. He said, "The national government belongs to the whole American people. Our whole experiment is meaningless unless we are to make this a democracy in the fullest sense of the word." And he said, "If the minority is as powerful as the majority, there is no use of having political contests at all, for there's no use in having a majority." So what I want to talk about today broadly is the fact that there is not a clear mechanism for the majority of voters in the United States to have their wishes made policy at the national level. The Senate, the House, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. It is possible for all these institutions to come essentially under the control of a minority of voters. And so we have this kind of rickety mechanism that can occasionally go pretty far away from majoritarianism. And we're at an unusual time in history where we get to see all those things happen at the same time, certainly as of now after the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. So gerrymandering is old, but it's been made new again by partisanship. It's 200 years old. It was over 200 years old. It was named in 1812 after poor Elbridge Gerry, who was a founder, governor of Massachusetts at the time, was presented with a districting plan, and it was promptly branded a gerrymander by an editorial cartoonist in the Boston Gazette in 1812. And this curiously shaped district was drawn to help his party win more seats in the Massachusetts General Court than the opposing party. And this misshapen district was mockingly called, like a salamander, a gerrymander. And the idea of gerrymandering predates that, but this is when the name was applied. So it goes back to, I believe, Pennsylvania or Virginia. I have an earlier claim to what we now call gerrymandering. So it's been around for a long time, and at that time it was done for partisan reasons. Now at that time the technology was not terribly good, and so this gerrymander was reversed. Just 1 year later, there was quite an unpopular war, the War of 1812, and a lot of people lost office. And consequent to that, this gerrymander was actually overcome. Hold on for a second. Let's see if my technical skills will turn the mic back on. All right, good. I hope that worked. We'll find out. We can fix it in post. Okay, so let me talk about ways that one could fix gerrymandering within the current system. And let me just talk about the kinds of fixes that one could attempt. These are fixes I'm going to tell from a very personal point of view. There are hundreds of people across the nation who are working as reformers, as litigants, as scholars, trying to do something about gerrymandering. And I'm going to give you a fairly personal view about exactly the way it looks from my point of view and what the road ahead looks like to me. And so pardon me if I leave out some pretty important figures in this. I'll try to mention them along the way, but it's actually tough to think of all the people who have worked on this. So one fix, I'm going to talk about all these three fixes in the coming half hour or so. I'm going to talk about a fix in federal courts, specifically the Supreme Court, how that has gone, a fix in state courts using state laws and the state constitution, and then finally a third fix, what I will call the new federalism, an appreciation for federalist principles, which are usually the province of the right, but I think that people on the left, progressives and reformers, are about to discover a newfound love of the new federalism. And on top of these attempts to fix these bugs, I'm going to say to the technically minded people in the audience, there are some fixes that may sound attractive to you. I can name them. I'll just name briefly. You want the districts to be nice shapes. You want an algorithm to do it. You want various kinds of fixes that will automatically fix, in your view, gerrymandering. The fundamental problem with any fix is the system has to want to be fixed. Okay, so this is different from fixing a bug in like PowerPoint or Excel or something like that, where you get the coders to say, no, the cell crashes when I do this. The system actually has to want to be fixed. And this is a really hard problem. Basically, the plane has taken off. It's been flying for a few hundred years. It's starting to show some wear and tear. And the plane is already in flight. And now we have to fix the plane. And that's the problem. It's a little bit like, that Apollo movie where they're heading to the moon, right? Apollo 13. And they have to fix things while they're in flight. It's a little bit more like that, as opposed to something where we can sit around in front of our terminals and say, well, why don't you just run MCMC and then that'll help you, whatever. Sorry, I had to slip in it. It's the only time MCMC is going to come up in this talk. Okay, so we can talk about it afterwards. Okay, so since 2012, gerrymandering has really reached new heights, and this is a graphic from the first piece I ever wrote about this. This is in the New York Times. I wrote this in 2013. These are curiously shaped districts. Now, I should say the curiously shaped districts are not always present in a gerrymander, but this is just to show you the kind of creativity that legislators will go to in order to select their voters artfully and say, well, I'd like these voters, I don't want those voters so much. And I will start by saying these districts are drawn by various parties, one party more than the other, but I will say that the shared feature of 6 out of these 7 districts is that they are inland. The only coastline here is the south shore of Lake Erie is here. This is the north shore of the north end of Ohio. Everything else here is an inland district. And so this is Michigan, which we've been working on a bit. North Carolina, that got redrawn basically by court order. This one got redrawn by court order. And so there are some things that have happened to undo these gerrymanders. But this is just to point out that people will go to great lengths to select voters that are agreeable to them as legislators, because it'll make their office safe. They'll be able to pick their own voters instead of their voters picking them. Now, I want to show you, just before we get into the topic of how to address these things, I want to convince you that in fact there's something unusual that's been happening in the last 1 or 2 redistricting cycles, 10 or 20 years. This is now probably the nerdiest plot I will show. It's a graph of how much of the 2-party national vote was won by Democrats or Republicans, where if Democrats won more votes nationally, it's on this side of the vertical axis. If Democrats won fewer votes, it's on this side. And so this is the Democratic 2-party national vote share. And then the vertical axis is how much of the House of Representatives they gained control of. And each one of these dots is one national election starting from 1946 and going through 2016. So going from Truman to the end of Obama's presidency. And you can see here that the black dots are basically 1946 to 2010. And you can see that there's this maximum polygon that I've drawn here that indicates that there was this general relationship between votes and seats. And that was a general relationship that was kind of noisy, but it basically held pretty well for 70 years. But you can see here that there are these 3 data points that don't fit with the others. And that's unusual. I was brought to the study of this by the fact that I had correctly in 2012 suggested that based on polling data, Democrats would win the popular vote. I thought that therefore they had a pretty good chance of gaining control of the House of Representatives, and that was wrong. And I wanted to know why that was wrong. I had frankly ignored the pleas of some of my readers at the Princeton Election Consortium who pointed out that gerrymandering was really bad this year. And I said, well, we haven't had an election yet. Why should I believe you? And then reality, whacked me in the face with this election result that was a physical realization of what had been done in the redistricting cycle following the 2010 census. And you can see here that there's this gap between past elections and 2012. It persists in 2014, 2016. And this gap corresponds to about a dozen seats. So for example, just to give you an example, this year, in about 4 weeks, we're going to have an election. And Democrats need to win 23 seats in the House in order to gain control of that chamber. Without partisan gerrymandering, I've calculated that the number they would need to gain is more like 11 seats. And so that difference of about a dozen seats is thanks to creative districting that's been done in state after state, mostly by Republicans, in one case by Democrats. And that repeated redistricting creativity has led to a tilt of the playing field that favors one side more than the other. Okay, so there's ways you can quantify this. I just want to show you, this is just a visualization at my gerrymandering site. The Princeton Gerrymandering Project has formed in response to all this, and this is one of our work products. You can go to it at gerrymander.princeton.edu. And you can see, depending on where you're from, well, we're in New Jersey. There's actually a slight Republican advantage in the House of Representatives, oddly. We can talk about that a little bit. But you can see that there's some pretty bad offenders. North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. These places get in the news for the amount to which they have distorted representation. And so these are really, and I should say that the states that I just named have the feature that they all have single party control of the redistricting process. One party control. It's called a partisan trifecta, where the House, the Senate, and the governor's mansion all control redistricting. An exception is North Carolina, where the governor has no say in redistricting, and so a trifecta is not necessary. But partisan trifectas correspond to these particular offenses in these 5 states that I've shown. By the way, if anyone has anything to say, if I seem to have left something out, I'm okay with being interrupted, because this feels like a moment where somebody might want to interrupt me. But I just
are there states with trifectas that nevertheless did an okay job?
That is occasionally the case. I will say that it used to be the case that single party control did not lead to huge partisan distortions. Broadly speaking, up until the 1990s, Democrats controlled Congress, and there was this kind of general belief that Democrats would always control Congress. And so gerrymandering was often done to protect individual incumbents. And what I think is that gerrymandering used to be done to protect individuals and not the whole party. And so therefore the focus was to do that. The other thing is that a partisan gerrymandering is more technological in nature. It's more subtle. And so I think it was harder to commit a partisan gerrymander at that time.
I wanted to ask one other question about this.
Yeah,
The orange states, I see New Jersey and California are both orange. I'm a little surprised by California. Assuming that's still a high.
Yeah. Let me, so it turns out in both cases, I believe, Hannah, who's on my staff, maybe you can do a quick web search just on the site to make sure. California actually oddly has an advantage for Republicans. And that, yeah, it's just.
Even after the 2011 redistricting?
So the short answer to this, and I don't really want to get too far into the weeds, is that if you draw districts without regard to partisanship and you just try to keep communities together, there's a little bit of a structural advantage favoring Republicans. And that is probably due to that fact. And so there was an independent commission of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, which seems like you know about that already. And so that's probably what's going on there. In the case of New Jersey, some of these states flicker. If you browse through the site and go year by year, they don't always show up as being orange or red. I'm focusing mainly on the red ones because the red ones actually stay red election after election. You're welcome to look through it and we can talk about it more later perhaps. Okay, so, right, so this is just an example of how much worse it's gotten. using the statistical measures that we've devised. I'm purposely leaving those out for clarity, at least for the moment. There used to be about one bad gerrymander per decade. This is a famous one that was committed by Phil Burton, a Democratic Party political boss in California. That picked up about 5 seats for the Democrats that year. So typically the statistical tests that we've devised used to flag about 1 per decade when applied to those data. But you can see starting in 2000, there are a lot of them, and then in the 2010s, 7 gerrymanders got picked up all on the Republican side. And so you can see there's something going on here. And what I would say that what's going on here is think about it as a police procedural, a crime procedural, means, motive, and opportunity, right? So the means is technology for redistricting, where it's possible to draw ever more clever gerrymanders. Motive is the partisanship that I mentioned before at the beginning, where partisanship has been really a major fuel that drives modern politics, and it's really gotten exceptionally bad since the 1990s. And then opportunity in the form of these trifectas, where there was a wave election in 2010 that really gave trifectas to quite a lot of states. And given the opportunity, then there was a pretty organized effort to aggressively redistrict on the Republican side, and that resulted in these 7 gerrymanders on this side. So there's a very clear mechanism. It's very well documented in a book by Dave Daly, who. Yeah.
I understand intuitively a gerrymander, but you've operationalized that variable so that it's a gerrymander, and there's a redistricting, which is sometimes a gerrymander and sometimes not, right? What's the criteria?
Redistricting is required after each census, more or less, because the law states that districts should be of equal population, and the only way that can be done is by redrawing districts. So redistricting is more or less mandatory in nearly all states after each census. Gerrymandering is broadly defined as districting that is drawn purposely to advantage an individual or party, or to disadvantage an individual or group or party. And the idea would be that it would be a gerrymander to, say, deprive representation of a minority group, to deprive representation of a whole political party. And then the question turns into compared to what, right? And so compared to what is what I'm going to talk about. Okay, did you want more, or is that enough? Okay, all right, so here's an example. So imagine we didn't know anything about the people. Each one of these is one or a group of people. Imagine if we didn't know anything about people. We, from an a priori point of view, wouldn't necessarily have a huge preference between these 2 plans for dividing up the people. But now imagine if we know a little bit about them. If we know that they have preferences for 2 political parties, let's call them greens and purples. If we know that, then we can do things like we can start being interesting and draw lines in ways that say, you know, let's take all these purples. Let's say we don't like those purples. Let's just take all those purples and stick them in a single district. And then let's just engineer nice, efficient, safe wins for our side, our green side, yay greens, boo purples. And then we can set up a situation that's 5 greens, 1 purple. This is an identical distribution. So these are the same distribution of people. And now, okay, let's do it this way. Now the purple party held the pen, and they said, well, we hate those you know, dastardly greens. And so we're going to draw the districts to help ourselves, 4 to 2, 4 purple, 2 green districts. And this is on our website, so you can like count the dots and check my math and see that it's correct. But the idea is that something like close to half of the seats in a state delegation are under the control of the redistrictor's pen. Clever redistricting can, in fact, swing about half the seats in a state, provided that there are enough districts to do that. So a state like Pennsylvania, you can do it in. Much harder to do in a state like, you know, a state with, like, say, 2 to 5 districts, very hard to do. But starting at about 6 districts or so, it becomes surprisingly easy to gerrymander if you have no regard for any other principles. And so, I meant principles of drawing districts. I didn't mean, like, moral principles. I don't know, maybe I meant both. So then this turns into a question of, well, what would be a fair thing to do? Let me talk about a way that we attempted to define this in federal court. So the first approach that we took was this is before the gerrymandering project became a multi-person project, so this started off with me working by myself and then finding collaborators when I discovered that I didn't know enough law to avoid making a fool of myself, and so I had to find collaborators who understood law or social science well enough to help me out of the fix I'd gotten in. But I'd come up with simple statistical tests to understand when one party was being treated asymmetrically relative to the other party. The idea being that there's some kind of symmetry in which the 2 parties in some sense should be treated equally. Could we come up with some principle to define it to the Supreme Court? And so federal election law turns out to be a pretty hard thing to crack. It's thought of as, in the domain of partisan gerrymandering, was thought of as an impregnable fortress. We almost did it. Think of the federal election law in the domain of partisan gerrymandering as being like the Death Star here. And you know, the people who drew the gerrymanders, or actually no, it's not a good analogy, but anyway, but think of the Death Star as being federal election law. And then if you can find some way to like just go down the ventilation shaft, right, you could possibly do that. But it was said that it was not, in fact, a justiciable problem. So the late Justice Scalia said that it was basically impossible to define partisan gerrymanders in an objective way, that judges should stay out of it, justices of the Supreme Court should stay out of it. And he thought that this is just a bad thing to do, and he suggested that we should just that legislators should be left to their own devices. And although partisan gerrymandering was undesirable, it was not a good move for judges to get into the mix. So what we thought we'd do is, there's a lot of complicated stuff we can do, but what I thought would be a good idea would be to try to come up with some simple way to measure whether one party had gotten an advantage over the other side. And I went all the way back to something that, you know, if you've taken any statistics at all, you probably know what student's t-test is. You may not know that student was William Seeley Gossett. He was an experimental brewer at the Guinness Beer Company. That was the Bell Labs of its time. They were constantly trying new technologies. They were really interested in shipping 500 million pints of stout, you know, to far-flung places across the ocean. They wanted to have good quality control. And he was the most math-oriented of all the experimental brewers. And he was sent off to go do a sabbatical with Carl Pearson, who was one of the principal figures in the early era of statistics. And he figured out how to compare averages. You know, the question was, when has an average quality of, say, of a batch of hops gone off from the expectations? And he wanted to know when those hops had been off, you know, the expected average. And he was, you know, very pleased with what he had figured out. He figured out how to compare averages. He was chuffed, I suppose. And he wanted to publish this, but his employer said, no, that's a trade secret. And so he said, well, I need a pseudonym. And he looked at his lab notebook, and this is his lab notebook. And you can see it says the Student's Science Notebook. And so the Student's Science Notebook gave him the pseudonym Student, and he published Student's t-test, literally the oldest test in the book. And we thought that it would be a good way to measure advantage. So in other words, if one side's average wins are much larger than the other side's average wins, then that side has probably been packed into a few districts. So the idea would be that if those average wins are different from one another, then that would be a sign that the parties are being treated differently. And I partnered with Heather Gerken, who went here to Princeton and who is the dean of the Yale Law School. She's been in the news a bit lately. But Heather and some leading political scientists, Jonathan Katz, Gary King, Larry Sabato, and I wrote an amicus brief for the Supreme Court where we said, look, treating the two sides fairly goes all the way to antiquity, goes to Genesis, Matthew, William Shakespeare, The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. My contribution here was Pinafore by Gilbert and Sullivan. And then Heather's contribution is Rawls, A Theory of Justice. So, you know, what we each were good for. We actually had trouble, we left out Freaky Friday because we could not agree which version of Freaky Friday was better to put in here. I thought the original, and she thought the Lindsay Lohan version, and we decided that because of the conflict, the partisanship of that question, that we thought we'd leave that out. So this almost worked. I will tell you that, let's see, first let me tell you about the idea. The idea is just that before redistricting, for instance, this is the Michigan U.S. House delegation where both sides had average wins in the mid 60% range. And then after redistricting, suddenly one side had much larger wins. The Democratic side had wins in the 75% range, and the other side had wins more like in the 60% range. And that difference fails students' t-test. And so that failure of students' t-test is an example of somehow this could not have, you know, is unlikely to have arisen by chance, and it arose suddenly from 2010 to 2012. So it tells you that some force made this happen because people didn't move suddenly in or out of Grand Rapids or Ann Arbor or what have you, or Flint, from this year to this year. Something happened fairly suddenly. And that sudden thing that happened was that the Republican Party gained a trifecta in Michigan and controlled the redistricting process. So we thought this was pretty cool. We thought it was pretty simple. We presented it to the Supreme Court. In a unanimous decision in the Gill versus Whitford decision, Chief Justice Roberts said, we have no problem with the plaintiff's math, and they cited our brief. So it's a pleasure to be cited in a Supreme Court brief. I pointed out that it could be calculated with a pencil and paper. Chief Justice Roberts actually quoted those words. I was, chuffed about that, so that was good. However, as if those of you who have been following this case, they said, but the math is not the point. And they turned it back saying that, well, we don't want statewide measures. What we want is a district by district measure. Let's turn it back, and then maybe we'll come back. And the swing vote, Anthony Kennedy was part of this decision, so let's send it back, including the swing vote, down to the lower court. And then right after releasing that opinion, Kennedy retired. Okay, so Kennedy said, I've been thinking about this for 20 years. I left out the whole story, but he said, I've been thinking about it for 20 years. I could imagine some definition of partisan symmetry or partisan gerrymandering. Just haven't seen it yet. Haven't seen it yet. Haven't seen it yet. Why don't you guys go do a do-over? And by the way, I'm retiring. So it's unfortunate. The fundamental idea is pretty simple, which is, now this is a histogram of wins in states that have Republican-controlled redistricting, and the Republican wins are very close wins because they're close to the 50-50 line. The Democratic wins are very far. If you look at all congressional districts, there's more of a distribution of districts, but you can tell here that something was pretty carefully engineered here from the way these two humps are. And you can see this hump is farther from 50-50, this one's closer to 50-50. And it's suggestive of the idea that there is something specifically engineered. And we thought this was pretty simple, but I think that with the new Supreme Court, the case is going to come back before the court. As you may know, Brett Kavanaugh was sworn in, and so they have a full court of 9 justices now. And I would say that it is pretty unlikely that they're going to be sympathetic to this idea. And I would be super surprised if they ended up ruling that tests like this could be usable. I'd be very surprised if that happened. Okay, so the court, just to familiarize you with how they are in election law, in this domain, they're closely divided, as in many areas. This is just an example, and this is an example that comes up later towards the end. This is a 5-4 decision in which these justices are arranged in order of their ideology, from Clarence Thomas at this end and Ruth Bader Ginsburg on this end. This is a 5-4 decision upholding the use of commissions to redraw districts, congressional districts. And you can see here that Anthony Kennedy provided the key 5th vote upholding these commissions. Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, wrote a pretty stinging dissent saying that Article 1 of the Constitution said it had to be the legislature, and there was no possible way it should be any other way, and it was just unconstitutional. And so Roberts did not carry the day, but we'll see what happens when Justice Kavanaugh is, he's probably not going to be here at this point. I think at this point, most court watchers believe that now Chief Justice Roberts is now the swing vote on the court, and Kavanaugh is going to be somewhere over here. Right, so that's the belief of people who watch the writings of these jurists pretty closely. Okay, so we did some great math. Chief Justice Roberts praised us, gave us a pat on the head, great, but unlikely to carry the day. However, it turns out that math, those of you who do math, know that math used in one domain can often be used in another context because the math stays good. So that's good. And so I want to now talk very briefly about state courts and where that's headed. This is now the one bright spot of partisan gerrymandering reform that affects this fall's election. Every other case has been delayed and delayed and ended up not having really an effect. But this is a case where the map actually got redrawn by order of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And this is the map that got redrawn. One of the districts I showed you before is a famous district called the Goofy Kicking Donald Duck District. But it's somewhere over here. And it got redrawn. And so you don't see shapes like that in this particular map. This is the court-ordered remedial map on the right. And it has, it's based on previous election voting patterns, would elect 10 Republicans, 8 Democrats, but it's got 6 close races, which means that there are a lot of seats that are competitive up for grabs. It means that there's a lot at stake for both parties going into this November's election in 4 weeks. And so therefore there's a lot of campaigning. There's a lot of responsiveness to voters. This is a very responsive map that responds to voter opinion. This on the other side here was proposed by the Pennsylvania Republicans. It looks like a pretty good map. It doesn't have such offensive shapes as the original map, but a 50-50 vote in this map would actually produce 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats, which in fact is the breakdown of the original gerrymander that was drawn in 2010. So you can see that, in fact, shapes are not really enough. One needs to have other ways of defining these offenses. And just I've shown you, it's a little hard to tell this under these lighting conditions, but you can see that a lot of it consists in creative ways of splitting up cities, where you can have a city here, Wilkes-Barre and Scranton are here. Pittsburgh gets carved up in various ways. Philadelphia gets carved up in various ways. And so the very careful way of splitting up these, like when you see a population density map and a district line go kind of down the middle of it, that's an indication that somebody went to a lot of trouble to take that population and find a way to do what's called cracking that population. So the populations of these cities were cracked. I think one of these is Reading, and I forget what the other one is, maybe Harrisburg. Yeah, Reading and Harrisburg. And see that Reading was split down the middle, Harrisburg was split down the middle in the proposed map. But you can see over here in the map that was eventually implemented by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, Reading is actually, if you zoom in, Reading stays inside one side of this, Harrisburg is entirely inside a district. And so these kinds of principles, don't split up cities, don't split up counties, build competitiveness. It's possible for a talented redistrictor to observe those principles, and it turns out that one can draw, in fact, a reasonably partisan neutral map that's competitive by doing so. And my main point is that this is done by order of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It was done under the Commonwealth Constitution. It was not a federal question. And so this was appealed by the Republican side, by the legislature, to the Supreme Court. And Justice Alito, who is no liberal, Justice Alito just said no, it's just refused to hear the case. And so it ended up not being reviewed by the Supreme Court because there was no federal question. And so, yes?
There is still a live appeal in the Supreme Court.
No.
Yes, there is. It's 17-1700 on the Supreme Court website. You can look it up.
And what have they done with it?
Nothing yet. They just finished the briefing schedule. So.
I would be pretty surprised if they did anything with it. We can come back to it, but I would be very surprised if they did. I mean, you know, I've been surprised before, but
Well, we've got a new court now, right? So things can
yeah. I don't think there are 5 votes for that, but we can talk about it later.
fingers crossed.
Okay, so the point is that for the time being, okay, so I just have to say, I'm going to push back just a little bit more and then we're going to go on. In order for there to be a federal question, there would probably have to be an affirmative right in the Constitution to commit a gerrymander. And there is no affirmative right in the Constitution to commit a partisan gerrymander. So, but we can come back to it. Stop now. Okay, thank you. All right. No, it's just that I want to get through what I have to say. I kind of like what you're saying, but we've got to keep on going. Okay, so this is a case where the math, Professor Moon Duchin, she's at Tufts University. She is a geometer and is very interested in the geometry of districting. Several of us who are technically minded weighed in, and in the end, we were able to be somewhat helpful. And so I think there's hope for using mathematical principles, mathematical arguments. So I think there's possibility of a fix in state courts. It's going to depend on having a friendly court. An example of a friendly court would be the Pennsylvania court, obviously. Another example would be the North Carolina Supreme Court. That's a place where federal action seems likely to be doomed, but there's a possibility of pursuing these things under the state courts. I should say here that the reason that these things are possible under state courts is that state constitutions have a lot of the same principles as the US Constitution. So an example would be Justice Kagan says that partisan gerrymandering is justiciable under the principles of the First Amendment because you should not discriminate against people on account of viewpoint. And viewpoint discrimination is a First Amendment principle. And virtually all state constitutions have a First Amendment-like provision. Another example would be the one person, one vote principle, which emanates from the US Constitution. And there are one person, one vote-like provisions in most state constitutions. Another provision being that the laws of a state shall be applied equally to all citizens of the state. These are just examples of provisions that can be found in state constitutions. So there seems to be a lot of fertile ground, and the question is finding a court that would be interested in applying those principles in a systematic way. And I should say I should just say on the side that Rick Ober, who's been working with us on doing legal research, has been going through legal literature and found that there are, he's so far found 125 instances of state courts overturning a district on account of gerrymandering based on state law. And so there's an abundant paper trail of gerrymanders that have been reversed using state law. So this seems like a pretty promising route, at least for the time being. Okay, so therefore, I'm very pleased that several members of my group and I, Brian Remlinger, Ben Williams, and I won a contest recently that Common Cause put out asking for new tools in a writing contest. They wanted new tools, new legal theories for dealing with partisan gerrymandering. And I will say without embarrassment that we just used the same mathematical tools. We've grouped into 2 groups. We said some of those measure defects in opportunity where the 2 parties don't have the same opportunity to win. Some of them have unequal outcomes where the number of seats is not commensurate with what one would expect. in a neutral process. And we said, given these two kinds of tests, opportunity and outcome, let's now say, apply state constitutions and state laws. And we just pointed out that these principles, the math, is indifferent as to whether it's the US Constitution or state constitutions. And so we suggested that, and we were very pleased to have them call, this is their wording, they said a Swiss Army knife paper, basically pulling together different kinds of math approaches and mapping it onto state law and state constitution. So we're very pleased about this. It sets the table for a lot of work ahead. This is the beginning of a long road in which we're going to find out whether this approach is going to work. I see North Carolina as being a pretty good place to try this out, maybe some other states as well, depending on how elections go, honestly, in the next few years. Depending on a Supreme Court election in Michigan that's about to happen in 4 weeks, that could be a place to try this out. Depending on a few Supreme Court elections in Wisconsin, it could turn out. And these are, state-level races that we, I think, as citizens often don't pay a whole ton of attention to. But it turns out that state-level races are quite important for influencing how local government is run. Okay, so finally, I just want to end up with what I'll call the new federalism, the idea that elections are regulated by a combination of state law and federal law. And federal law, election law, has a lot of rules. From that, we get the fact that districts have to be of equal population. We get principles about how minority groups should be represented. There are principles that come from federal law. But partisan gerrymandering and certain other kinds of offenses are currently not defined by federal law. And what that means is that there's a void there, and it is possible for states to regulate these things. And so therefore, we've gotten very interested in that. And the broad categories of reform are lawsuits, which I've already mentioned, voter initiatives, which are currently on the ballot this November in 4 weeks in Michigan, Utah, Missouri, and Colorado. And then these voter initiatives can do different kinds of things. They can establish commissions. They can establish rules. And this table is a little bit misformatted. What we think is important is to establish some kind of legal doctrine that unifies partisan fairness and Voting Rights Act compliance. This should be possible either in lawsuits or in voter initiatives. So either commissions of human beings or rules that limit the kinds of things that can and cannot be drawn. Those are the kinds of things that can happen on a state-by-state basis, and these are not in conflict with the federal Constitution. And so this is just different examples of how it can be. There's independent commissions on the ballot in Michigan and in Colorado. There's a nonpartisan demographer who's going to redraw with instructions to apply principles of partisan fairness. That's Amendment 1 that's on the ballot in Missouri. And then Proposition 4, where there's a bipartisan advisory commission that's going to make an attempt at drawing fairer districts in Utah. Utah is a place where there's a lot of value put in good government and fairness. And so that's a state where, even though it's a highly partisan state, it is also a state with a culture of fairness and fair play. And so there's a possibility of gaining reform in a state like Utah, deep red state. Okay, so here's something we're doing, and I'm going to end up with this. One thing we're working on is finding ways to use data to level the playing field to get as many people involved as possible in redistricting. So far, I've talked about things that are out of the reach of many people, lawsuits, publishing law review papers, litigating. There's a role for citizens in voting for initiatives, but not all states have an initiative process. What we thought is that it would be a good idea if all citizens could somehow get involved in redistricting. And so there's this project that we're very excited about, and this is our newest direction, which is to establish open data and open software for redistricting. And the idea is to gather what I would call legislative quality data to allow citizens to draw districts that are legally binding. And I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. But the idea would be to have public data that is available to everyone, that is as good as the data available to legislators, to redistricting commissions, and then they can draw their own districts. So this requires a high quality data, which I'll show you what I mean by that. It requires access to redistricting software, and we're currently looking into partnering with various organizations, including Dave's Redistricting, which is basically some Microsoft engineers who wanted to do some good in their spare time, and they've created this app that allows people to just draw districts on their laptops. And then Esri, which is a giant in this area, they've created a standard called ArcGIS, and the ArcGIS system has a redistricting module, and we're looking into ways to make that available for citizens to use. And they've done that before. They did that in Utah, actually. And so Esri has a history of being very interested in openness. And so we're gathering data ourselves for 4 states. Hannah, who's here in the room, there's Hannah over there. Hi, Hannah. And several who couldn't make it today are gathering data in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan, and Virginia. And we're eventually, in time for redistricting, we're hoping to expand to all 50 states and DC and Puerto Rico in time for 2021 redistricting. So the idea is to create a 52 jurisdiction, let's call it a 52 state database for redistricting. I didn't mean anything by that, it's just a term of art. Here's an example of what can be done. This is a racial gerrymandering case that's currently being litigated and played out in Virginia. It's called Bethune Hill, and you can look it up under that. So it's a case where the legislature may or may not redraw the map, or the court will do it for them. And this is the enacted map here. This is just a zoom in on Norfolk. And I could show you a similar map that kind of looks like this qualitatively in Richmond with lots of jaggy lines. And so that's the enacted map. And we've gathered complete precinct data, including geography, exact positions of all the lines, and election data to let people do this kind of thing. We've made this publicly available on a GitHub, and we've made it all, just as proof of principle, we wrote a piece for the Virginian Pilot, which is a regional newspaper in that part of, let's call it Eastern Virginia, to show how it could be done. We wrote about that, and we've made the data publicly available to all comers. This is just one reform map. We drew this. Ben Williamson from my group drew this map using Maptitude, which is a commercial product. And he drew this and made it publicly available. It's not that we want this map to be enacted. We just wanted to show that it could be done. And so we did that. We've been working a fair bit with One Virginia 2021. Ben's map has been used by law students at William & Mary Law School. And so we're hoping that we're moving the needle a little bit on getting people in Virginia involved in the process. We have, if you look on our website, I posted it both at gerrymander.princeton.edu and also at election.princeton.edu. It's possible for you to browse these things. Okay, so now I said a high quality map. You might think, doesn't such a thing exist? How many of you have played with this particular thing in the New York Times? Okay, and it looked really impressive. I looked up my neighborhood, it was great. This is a tool that allows you to look around. It's called an extremely detailed map of the 2016 election, and you look around and find your own precinct. You can find out the partisanship of your neighbors. I really very impressed to find out just how many people in my precinct voted for Gary Johnson and Jill Stein. 0. That was, highly educated voters who understood that their vote was most powerful if they voted for the top 2 candidates. Nothing bad to say about Gary Johnson. But the idea is that it looks like a really impressive tool. Let's zoom in a little bit. This is Manassas Park, Virginia. As a northerner, I think of it as Bull Run Park, Virginia. But anyway, but if you look here, these are precincts. So it looks pretty good, right? The lighting doesn't really quite show it, but there's some problems here. Do you see these little white wedges here? So this is a database. This is a commercial database that was made available to the New York Times and is sold at considerable cost or licensed. And it's supposed to be an accurate record of precincts. And it looks from a distance pretty good, but it's kind of like when you wear a costume on stage. Everything looks good, and then you look behind and they've got masking tape on. Yeah, it's kind of like that. If you look here, there's like a white zone here. If you live here, you're in apparently no precinct at all. You're apparently in no precinct at all. If you live in this region here, it's a little bit hard to tell here, this kind of purpley region, you apparently live in 2 precincts at the same time. So you can see that there's a little bit of a problem when you look very closely. Now if you zoom out a little bit, it's even worse. So Hannah, do you have the map handy? You forgot the map. Okay, so we have a physical map that we got from Manassas Park. And this is a scan of that map. So this is the kind of effort that we went to. It's god-awful. Anyway, and in this lighting, it's a little bit hard to tell, but I hope you can tell that this is Manassas Park and that's Manassas Park. I just want to point out that the boundaries between the precincts are here and here, and I hope you can see that these boundaries have no resemblance to these boundaries. Yeah. These are not just inaccurate, they're just completely wrong. There was probably a time in Manassas Park's history that these were close to the boundaries, ignoring the white parts and the purple parts. There's probably a time when those are the actual boundaries of Manassas Park, but they're just not. I mean, I can tell you that, I think some of Ben Williams' law school buddies showed up and was it mailed to us or? This one was mailed. Okay, that was a mitzvah. Okay, we got it mailed to us. It's wonderful. And so, but you can see here that there's basically inaccuracies, and this is the problem. Existing public and private databases have a lot of errors. There's free data online. The data fell off a truck. It's repackaged and sold by somebody who wanted to make money from it. Very little quality control. And so this is the difficulty for any citizen group. Any citizen group wanting to get involved in redistricting would get torn apart in court if they attempted to present a map based on this kind of data set. Here's one. This is our grand trophy. Ben, who does legal work, his office is here in CITP. He's from West Virginia, so he was kind of in the area. And so he drove from Harrisonburg, Virginia to Monterey, Virginia to Highland County. And this is Highland County. And you know, you can see here, this is not exactly the easiest part of Virginia to get to. He went to Harrisonburg and drove he says 2 hours, so basically 2 hours here across this windy, switchbacky area. Here's a bunch of houses and so on. If you can see, this is like this attractive landscape that's like all nice and devoid of houses. Yeah, it's devoid of houses because it's like this mountainous area that you have to go like this to get across. So he drove 2 hours to get there. You look what he wrote here. Eventually I figured that an unsigned trailer on the side of a hill with no walkways leading to it, the opposite of ADA accessible, was the auxiliary trailer with the precinct boundary map. Once there, the people were very helpful in letting me take pictures, but they just couldn't take one themselves and email it to me because the internet was dial-up. And so this is the photograph that Ben got for his troubles for driving 2 hours and back another 2 hours to Harrisonburg. This is, in some cases, really hard data to get. In the best cases, you just call them up, they send you a PDF, everything's great. If you get somebody sophisticated, they'll send you shape files, it's kind of awesome. In the worst cases, poor Ben, right? 4 hours round trip to Monterey. I didn't even know there was a Monterey in Virginia, but there is. And so the idea is that we'd like to do as much of this ourselves as we can, but at some point it probably needs to be powered by citizens. We'd like to do it that way because it creates the most open data. And so now this is a project that's from the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group. This is Moon Duchin's outfit in Boston. And this is just a mosaic of all the maps that they gathered to do Ohio. They collaborated with us to do that. We worked together. John O'Neill of my group was very helpful in that domain, in that area. And so this is just a fanciful representation of all the maps they gathered. But you know what it takes is, this is now the participants in Moon's workshop, and this is a view from above, and you can see them, you know, all after gathering the maps. This is like a whole bunch of geography majors and other computational types cleaning those maps, creating shapefiles, doing things that only tech people can do. And so it's a way that tech people can get involved in redistricting and gerrymandering and help, you know, repair democracy a little bit using the skills that are theirs. And of course, like nerds everywhere, you can see the pizza boxes, right? Pizza boxes, very important part of this effort. Okay, and so the other part of it is open access redistricting software. I've already mentioned this. There are a couple of options. I won't get into it too much, but the idea is that eventually this needs to be married to redistricting software. And what we're hoping to do is provide simple dashboard measures of how one can tell whether a map is any good or not, whether it meets basic criteria, whether the population differences are small, or the compactness is okay, or not very many counties are split, or whether it's too partisan. So for instance, these are just 4 criteria, just basic competence in redistricting. And then these are measures of fairness where if you can define racial ability to elect districts in software, which we believe we can, then you can count how many of those there are. You can count how partisan a plan is. And the idea is to create a dashboard that helps people evaluate the partisanship of a plan. And again, that democratizes the whole process. So the road ahead for us is exciting. We're hoping that this will be eaten and done away with in some way. And so, you know, the steps ahead for us are to work with citizen groups and perhaps craft legislation, or to at least critique legislation to try to seal loopholes and analyze the reform initiatives. As I said, we're hoping to provide help for state-level activists. We think that's very important, to have citizen groups powered to carry out these reforms themselves. And our contribution to this is going to be to lower the barrier for entry. And our hope is to help provide open data and software that's going to really make this an activity for everyone in the United States. I will stop there, and I'll thank you very much for your time, and I'll be glad to take any questions. In the back.
I assume you have some sort of multivariate objective function that determines the extent to which the particular districting is fair. Is it also true that you could invent a lot of different kinds of algorithms that would optimize that in lots of different ways? And if you did that, would you have a lot of different, very different kinds of redistrictings, all of which seem to satisfy the rules?
We specifically do not have a multivariate objective function. Researchers are very interested in this approach, and I'll say what I think you mean to everyone else and to see if you agree. imagine if we had a single numerical measure that captured racial fairness, partisan fairness, compactness, and we just had a single function that weighted all these things in some way, and a number that was just a score, 0 to 100, that said, how good is this plan? We specifically have not gone down that road. We've been in conversations with Dave's redistricting, and we're pretty convinced that that's not a suitable approach because there are a lot of factors. It turns out that when you draw these lines, there are people inside those lines. And they have thoughts about being represented. So like I was looking at a dot map of Detroit, and there's like this little place called Mexican Town. People of Hispanic origin are in that town. There's another place where you can find people of Arab origin. So it turns out that when you go and like meet those people or correspond with those people, they have all kinds of views about how they like to be represented. And I am firmly of the belief that it is very hard to capture that with an algorithm. And so I think that one could design an objective function, but we are purposely avoiding that because I think that there are certain kinds of measures like racial ability to elect, which is firmly grounded in the law. These simple measures of partisanship, which can be done in an Excel spreadsheet or even on a piece of paper. And then these things that courts require. Courts recognize this, courts define this, and these are standards that, you know, I guess we could turn this into an objective function of some kind. I think it's certainly possible to do so, but we've kind of gone away from that. It might be interesting in some ways to calculate an objective function for partisanship, but I'm not too enthusiastic about that because I think it's not a tool. I don't think there's much demand for the tool because these things turn into activities of human beings trying to draw lines, either commissions or, you know, it's hard to write algorithms. Like when you look at a law that says how districts should be drawn, it's impossible to turn that law into an algorithm. And so I think it's super hard to do that. I think one could do it, but I am currently pretty firmly unenthusiastic about it. But, you know, I mean, check with me in a few months and maybe I'll say, oh God, what was I thinking? Of course for the time being, I think it doesn't solve the problem that needs to be solved. But, you know, we could talk more. Let's see.
Will the 2020 census actually change some of your results, or will your results impact the way the 2020 census is going to be interpreted?
Yeah, 2020 census is super interesting. People in the redistricting domain and the voting rights domain have gotten really interested in the census because if a population gets undercounted, then that population is at risk of being underrepresented. From a quantitative standpoint, gerrymandering is a much worse problem than a small undercount because, as I said before, something like half the seats in a state are under the control of the redistrictor's pen. So purely from a numerical point of view, gerrymandering is way worse than any jiggery-pokery that can be done with the census. Now that having been said, the census has important implications for like housing allowances, funding that neighborhoods and communities get. There are a lot of reasons to be extremely interested in an accurate census count, but I would characterize it as just one thing of many problems. And the reason that I work on redistricting and gerrymandering is that it's technical, but it actually has really profound consequences for representation. So I think the census is a super interesting topic, but I think it's for reasons that are a little bit different from this one.
Is there any, when you talk about different options that you see as kind of a road forward, is there any credence given to the idea of taking these same kind of philosophical or legal arguments instead of trying to say that we should put an independent committee to redistricting, instead do, say, state ballot measures to change to a proportional representation system and change it to like a single transferable vote with multiple representatives per district. Yeah. And that way you allow them to keep their districting powers. But. So
the proportional representation concept is an attractive one. So for instance, if it would be something like Pennsylvania's got 18 representatives, we shall, 18 representatives shall be apportioned so that if the vote is 50-50, each party gets 9, right? So the Israeli Knesset does that more or less if you get above its threshold. And clearly partisanship is not a problem in Israel. But really the real problem I think with that kind of plan is that federal law requires single member districts. And there's a long tradition in the US of wanting wanting your own Congress critter that you can complain to. And so I think I think that the idea is attractive in principle, but there are some problems that accompany it. There's some hybrid systems like in Germany where everyone gets elected by party and then the parties get topped up with extra seats to make representation proportional. So there are ways to implement it. They would require, depending on on what's needed, they require Congress to act or for the Constitution to be amended. And so I think that these are theoretically attractive, but require the system to want to be fixed. And so I think that, you know, for myself, I've not been working on that particular thing. But, it, you know, like the attraction is clear.
The Pennsylvania Supreme Court seems particularly interested in preserving county boundaries and in compactness, which I think is how we wound up with the three-pair map. And it also, so as I'm watching and listening to you, I have this epiphany that if you really focus on county boundaries and assembling districts for Congress, you almost avoid the problem of splitting metropolitan areas in the middle, because in most cases, the county seats are located in the center of each county. So in some ways, it kind of
it forces the issue, but you know, yeah, and I think there could be a strong argument made. I mean, I've sort of presented the whole thing with the implicit assumption that the normative good that we should be working towards is representation that represents proportionally the number of people who voted for each party. So like that was sort of hidden behind everything I said. But another principle might be communities ought to be represented. I should be able to be represented along with other people in Princeton Borough and Township. I guess it's just called Princeton now, but like I should be able to be co-represented with citizens of Princeton. And you know, there might be some crazy plan that makes representation different, but I have a right to that, and it's important for us to have a community that is represented. So that would be another normative principle. And so one advantage of the holding jurisdictions together idea is that it's easy to define. Now, if you look closely at city maps of certain places, there are places where cities have incorporated neighborhoods that they wanted to incorporate and didn't incorporate other neighborhoods that they didn't want to incorporate. And you do not win prizes for guessing the kinds of criteria that people used for incorporating or not incorporating. And so there is some difficulty with that as well. I mean, you know, I'm just saying that no way really is free of difficulties. But you can imagine that, I think you're right, you can imagine that holding jurisdictions whole where possible is, you know, it reduces the latitude that redistrictors have for being creative on party. Like here's a general challenge of federal law and also state law for redistricting. You can put more and more constraints on what legislators can do. And that's one way of constraining the problem. But what you end up with is very little latitude for legislators to actually take into account community considerations. And, you know, we make fun of legislators, but they actually do have the job of drawing these things, and they have to take into account community interests. And it may be that some legislatures, we as voters may not trust that much, but if we put a lot of constraints on them, then it actually makes it harder for them to do a good job drawing lines. And so I have a very sincere view about, like, legislators are elected to represent us, and they have a job to do.
So in regard to the data collection initiative you're talking about at the end there, of course, a lot of that data you're talking about, you know, the accurate precinct lines and census block lines and so forth, and also even the election data ultimately.
Yeah.
States have an obligation to collect the census data, of course, for every, you know, decadal census, and then they also tend to, I mean, they have an obligation to collect the election data at elections by precinct.
Yeah.
And at least in Pennsylvania, we know that they also deliberately merge those two data sets in order to use them for gerrymanders. They have the capacity to collect a data set that they consider accurate. And I guess what I'm wondering is, to what extent you thought about trying to coordinate with state governments to get, you know, those accurate census lines.
I think that's I think it would be a great thing. So we've chosen to do this under conditions of existing law, where the existing law is that every county manages its own elections. And here we are emailing registrars, calling them, getting PDFs, getting shapefiles, like driving across beautiful Western Virginia. But right, what if there were just a law that just mandated that shapefiles and election results shall be tabulated in GIS format in a relational database that could be downloaded? Like approach the legislator. Yeah, I've actually had conversations with Assemblyman Andrew Zwicker about how one would do that, and we've had some really productive conversations about how one would just write a bill that requires the state to do this thing, basically a sunshine law and that, you know, like, it would be awesome, right? And so, you know, I think one successful law in that domain would be potentially model legislation for other states to do that. And I think that is another approach. And it's just obscure enough that legislators might fall for it, right? So it might actually work. It's so crazy it just might work. It's like Scooby-Doo. So I think that it's a good idea.
Kind of related to what you're saying. If you have a reform strategy that's based on legislative action at the state level, so when you talked about that, you focused, as one might expect, on the most divided states where the action's really at. But how about if there was a legislative strategy to pursue this agenda in states where it's really not an issue? It's a little bit like your kind of going under the radar strategy. How about doing gerrymandering legislation where people don't care that much about it and therefore won't kill each other over it and won't fight it?
So an example of that, I don't know the legislative history, but a pretty good example of that is, I mean, legislators are never indifferent to redistricting. They always have some opinions on the subject. But, you know, one way to appeal to them is through fear. I believe that fear of losing party control in Iowa was behind a reform effort so that both major parties would minimize the worst outcome for their side. So that was kind of an interesting case. I think in the state of Utah, as I said before, there's a tradition of good government, and that's a state that's going to be, you know, really super Republican for a long time. And so they're not really under that much risk in some level of losing partisan control. But there's a culture there of wanting open government and so on. So Utah is actually an ideal place for that kind of thing. Each state requires its own approach, and I'm kind of thinking about like what you mean, like a state that like doesn't care that much. Certain states have a reputation for really favoring good government. Like I'm kind of thinking Minnesota would be.
States with only a single representative. Well, no, they still have a legislature.
There's the state legislature. Yeah, but Minnesota might be a good place because there's a culture there. There are certain states that have a expectation of open government. Oregon, I think, if I remember correctly, is kind of like that. So I think at this point, once one takes a federalist approach, one needs to start thinking really carefully about what a state is like. And at that point, local activists have views about how to achieve the best outcome there. I myself am somewhat knowledgeable about half a dozen of these states, and the rest of them, you know, we just got to make partners and friends there and find out what they think. I mean, I could like spitball for you about how we're going to do it in each of these states, but you know, I've done it for a few states. Yes.
Crazy idea. You mentioned speed, so here's as crazy as it gets. A year and a half ago, I was on a bus down to DC for the Women's March that was 90% angry grandmas from New Jersey talking about becoming political pioneers. They were frustrated about being in such a blue state, and they wanted to move to states where their vote would make more of a difference. So from a cost perspective and from a time to outcome perspective, how much would it cost to help people figure out where to move? Because many of these elections are hairs width apart. How much would it cost? I realize it's...
I'll take 0.0001% of that budget for my project. So there is an organization that does that. If you, it's on my, if you go to election.princeton.edu, the top post I have, there's an organization, I forgot what it's called, but they let students type in their home and school addresses, those who are at university away from home, to help them decide which place their vote is more powerful. And so there are attempts like that. I think moving itself would be somewhat prohibitive. Yeah, you're getting at, like, there's the fundamental difficulty of finding a way through the partisan polarization that we have in the US right now. And that's a big problem. And I would, just to step back from the gerrymandering question a bit, broadly speaking, demographics will probably solve some of these problems in some sense in about a decade or so to get us away from this 50-50 death match that we're in right now. And broadly speaking, the name of the game is to either prevent damage or to do repairs in the next decade so that we can make it through the current time and still be on speaking terms to each other as a nation by the end of it. And so I see us as being on a 10-year clock. Ed, do you have a thought about?
Let's take one more question.
Pressure. Is it okay? Okay, yeah, we'll talk later. Yeah, yes.
Do you see any risk to the state commissions with the change in the Supreme Court?
Yes. So these commissions typically will draw lines for both legislatures and Congress. Chief Justice Roberts has been very clear in that 5-4 decision that I mentioned that he is firmly of the opinion that the word legislature in Article 1 of the Constitution only means legislature. the author of the majority opinion on that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said if you look in dictionaries at the time, legislature means the power that makes the laws. And so Roberts was pretty clearly ticked at being rolled over. It's one of the few times when he wrote like a really angry dissent. And so it's likely, I would say that one should be very careful about being too optimistic about these commissions surviving when it comes to drawing congressional lines. However, the drawing of legislative lines is left to each state, and the US Constitution is silent on that topic. And what that means is that commissions that draw legislative state lines are likely to stand up. My legal guy, Ben Williams, is not here, but this is my current understanding of the topic. And what that means is, and it's more or less, I would say that practically speaking, that mostly solves the problem. Because if you draw a legislature that fairly represents the people of that state, well, at that point, you've like basically removed the means of committing a gerrymander, right? Because there's or you've removed like a way for one party to keep itself. So the danger is like kind of like the guy who lifted himself up by his bootstraps and was able to stay. This is where the word bootstrapping comes from. He was able to stay aloft forever by picking himself up by his own bootstraps. The danger is that in a state like North Carolina, you redistrict yourself into power and you just do that forever. And so there is no, to my knowledge, there is currently not a constitutional case for undoing a legislative commission. It's only in the domain of drawing congressional districts that John Roberts might be able to invalidate commissions. And we can talk about it more, but that's my understanding of the current landscape.
Great. Let's thank Sam again.